we're here to talk about books and how they work. The thing that, as a sort of an introduction to this, the runaway success of Harry Potter, like the success of The Lord of the Rings before it, was kind of a watershed moment in the history of literary fantasy. Before Harry Potter, children's books for the most part flew under the radar. Children read them, people like us who love children's books, people who had to because they were teachers continued to read them as adults, but most people put those things behind them and just figured that they were for children and they did not read them very often. Now there are millions of people all over the world who have read one children's book, at least, as adults. And they seem to think that it has come like the phoenix out of absolutely nothing, or like Athena out of Jove's head. It has simply arrived fully formed. And most of us in this room know that that is not so, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the influences, since most of us here, although we may have read Harry Potter certainly as it was coming out, our tastes were formed before there was a Harry Potter, or even before there was a strong commercial children's literature market. And so I would like to ask the panelists to talk a little bit about some of the books that they loved the most when they were growing up, and the ones that had influence over them in their formative years.
Tennant Lee had a huge influence on me. She's, for those of you who don't know, Tennant Lee is a completely insane English writer. I've never actually met her, but everyone who has met her goes, so I've decided not to meet her. But I mean, I really loved her books, but she's prolific. I mean, she actually makes Cassie look
lazy.
Yeah. Yes, that's the word I was looking for. But she claims never to edit anything, that everything is this stream that just pours out of her. And after you've read quite a few of her books, you start to decide that she's in fact not lying about that. Because I mean, when her books are on and when they're working, they're some of the best books, and particularly, I think she's better at short stories, and they just blow you away. But when she's insane.
I'm Botanic. She was actually quite nice for the 5 seconds that I talked to her. I was always a big Anglophile as a kid, probably why I write books set in London now. I was a huge fan of E. Nesbit, who wrote 5 Children in It, and gave me the impression that Cyril was a perfectly normal name, which is not. And I also really loved Enid Blyton, the Mallory Towers books. Loved all the Fantastic Five, I think. Let's see, Edward Eger, also Lloyd Alexander, who wrote the Chronicles of Prydain, which are based on the Welsh myths, and Evangeline Walton, a little bit less well known, wrote more literal sort of retellings of the Mabinogion. So I was very obsessed with the Arthurian myths and the Welsh myths. And probably my favorites were Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising series. I read those over and over.
Yeah, as a kid, I remember reading the Lloyd Alexander books over and over. I remember reading all the Madeline Lee Engels, the Wrinkle in Time series, and then the Austen series, and then how they meet up, and then there's all this other weird stuff, and I was chasing down all these different books, and it really, I think, started my love of the strange connected universe. It's dark. Definitely the Dark is Rising books were occasionally. I feel like I read also the Delirious Greek Myths. They're not fiction, but I remember the Delirious books as being massively influential, and I still see kids reading them. And I remember reading them well past, like just reading them over and over and over again. The Green No books.
The Children of Green No, right?
Yeah, I still remember Green No, Demon Tree, Evil Fingers Can't Catch Me, which you're never supposed to say, and now I will die if you never see me again. Like, now you know why. And I remember reading those books and then sort of crashing into adult fiction and crashing into sort of, I joined the science fiction book club, and I'm really bad at following deadlines, so I never would send the thing back to prevent getting the book. And so I got all of these different books, and I remember that's where I first found all the Kenneth Lee books. And,
Did you have the ones where her author photo was of her in an Egyptian headdress?
I had one of those, yeah.
I remember those. I blocked it out.
Well, I probably shouldn't admit this in public, but I was one of those really alarming children who can actually write Elvish and memorize large tracts of the Lord of the Rings. So, I still have my childhood copies of the Lord of the Rings, and they're not just worn out; they're so worn out that pieces of a lot of pages would like tear out in my hands as I was reading, and then I would tape them back in with Scotch tape. So that was, I think, absolutely huge. And then a lot of the same people that people are talking about here, I think particularly Lloyd Alexander is such a wonderful writer. For me, Ursula Le Guin, the Earthsea Chronicles actually were huge. I mean, that was a book, I still read that book certainly at least once a year, those 3 books. They're almost the most perfect fantasy books I can imagine. And then for me, Diana Wynne Jones was huge. So Crestomancy. But I get those as a
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of a Harry Potter precursor, the Crestomancy.
That's probably the strongest. I think the Crestomancy Chronicles are almost the strongest. But they also are drawing out of the school, the English school books.
Right?
Like Tom Brown's School Days, and then, I mean, Cassie brought out Enid Blyton, and do people here know who Enid Blyton is? Is there anyone who doesn't? Okay. So Enid Blyton, if you grow up in a Commonwealth country, which I did, Australian for those who are wondering, everybody is given Enid Blyton as a child. In fact, the first chapter book I ever finished was The Folk of the Faraway Tree, which she wrote. She's possibly one of the worst writers ever to and she has written more books than pretty much anyone.
And Lieutenant Lee.
I mean, it's just, her output was ridiculous. And I think she finished books as quickly as Georges Simeon did, who's famous for writing books in like a week. And they're very English, they're very kind of proper. There's this one short story that has always stuck with me as emblematic for her kind of morality throughout her stories, which is, it's called The Rotten Apple, and there are all these apples that are stored together, and one of them is rotten, so all the apples go bad because that one rotten apple was allowed in. And this is a direct analogy for this group of kids being friends with this weird kid and how you shouldn't be with him. So conservative, racist, horrible human being. Hugely influential on me, which is terrifying. But I mean, what was it that you loved about those books? I mean, because I was desperate to go to boarding school and I really wanted to have midnight feast.
And there was something about the Mallory Towers books that just made boarding school seem like it was just an endless round of fun. I mean, all the stuff with the prefects and the house points and all of that stuff that's later you see in Harry Potter, all that stuff is in Mallory Towers, and so you get caught up in the house rivalries and the relationships between the people in the school, and they have these midnight feasts and they run around playing hockey or lawn cricket or whatever they do. I don't remember what the sport was because it seemed like a made-up sport like Quidditch, but it was very important to them, and so I cared about it, and it just made it seem like boarding school was the most amazing place that you could go.
Well, the thing that really fascinates me as I listen to all of this is how little like your books that you actually wrote any of this stuff is, that your formative books have shown up only very slant in your own work. we are not a psychiatrist here, so I don't know why that is. But what was it? Do you think that encouraged you to write about? Mostly, you all write about urban settings, and by your own admission, the books that you really loved were very much rural or small town or whatever. So, what's up?
Well, I'm sorry. I guess I was when you asked what I read when I was a kid, I guess I was thinking a little younger than the age group that I write aimed at. And when I was, I write aimed at kind of 14 to, and up. And when I was an older teen, I read a lot of Anne Rice. I read the Border Town books, and they really they were hugely influential on me because if you don't know this, it was a shared world project. There was a magical place over the borderlands called Border Town that you could go to that was populated with motorcycle riding elves and all of this awesome sort of fusion of technology, modern culture, and folk tales and pop culture. And so that sort of opened my eyes to the idea that you could meld these things together. And then I also, I read an enormous amount of Anne Rice and vampire books and things like that. So I think those things also do affect me. If I were to write younger, if I was going to write a middle grade series, I think I would allow myself to be more influenced by the stuff that I read when I was that age.
No, I was just going to say that when we talk about YA, one of the real difficulties is we're talking about, Harry Potter is a strange book because it starts out about a 12-year-old, 11-year-old, and winds up being about a 17-year-old, and because of that, it sort of spans a wide range of categories, and it starts out sort of in a certain a certain much younger territory, and it winds up being comparative at least to books that we were reading when we were much older because of his age. And when we talk about YA and Harry Potter, we almost always wind up actually talking about middle grade.
Yeah.
And that, I think that's difficult because when you talk about Tana Lee, that's what I was reading, when I was older. Sort of we have that period where you crash into reading a mixture of kids' books and adult books, and I was also reading Anne Rice and Tori Windling and Jane Yolen and Ellen Kushner, and I kind of crashed into reading stuff that I think is closer to the stuff I read.
Yeah, and Harry Potter really is middle grade. It's not YA, and it does span, but it's also spawned the whole YA renaissance. So it's a complicated genre.
One of the big influences, and I think, I can't speak for Chris, but I know on Holly and Cassie as well, was reading a lot of retold fairy tales, and because Jane Yolen's in the room, and Briar Rose was, when I read that, it kind of blew my head off. It's
in a good way.
Yeah. And it wasn't originally published as YA, I don't think, but it really absolutely spoke to me. It was the first time seeing a fairy tale retold in such a kind of horrific setting. So it was kind of the mixture of, the Holocaust and fairy tales, which actually makes perfect sense, because so many of those fairy tales are just so dark, so twisted, so horrible, and so kind of, the cruelty in them comes out of nowhere. And
I think that's all, I can't speak for everybody, but I think I definitely went through a whole retold fairy tale phase when I was older, and I read Briar Rose. I did read also Red is Blood, kind of these retold fairy tales, which I think are actually the best thing that she's ever written. They're amazing. And also Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, which are also fantastic. And I think that if you look at those things, you do see in all of our books the roots of those fairy tales that go down really deep.
And the whole series that Tori Windling and Ellen Dallow edited, I had all of
the short stories that were. Like the Ruby Slippers, Tears.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't remember all their titles. I didn't write them in my tiny book of notes.
There's a fair amount of folklore and fairy tale that influences, especially in The Inquisitor's Apprentice.
Yeah, and I think Jane Yolen is a huge influence on me too, for really obvious reasons. And a lot of, I mean, we could stop if you want. Or we could go on all night. To me, I mean, it's interesting hearing you say that what I write seems different from the things that I read as a kid, because in some ways I feel like it's in conversation with them. And the only two people I don't feel like this about, who really influenced me as a child when I read things for the first time, are, for probably obvious reasons, Jane Yolen and Ursula Le Guin, where I felt like I was in their world, in the deep fabric of it. And it was a world that came, the ethics of the world, the sense of the world came from, you know, where I was coming from. And there was always a disjunction, and so I'm sort of, you know, Jewish, but it's complicated, and my grandfather emigrated from India, so I'm sort of not really Indian, sort of heavily Irish, and sort of partly Jewish, and never fit in anywhere. And so, to me, to read Tolkien, or to read a lot of the classic English fantasy writers, was always kind of, I loved them, I was swept away by them, but there would always be those kind of jolting moments where you would realize that, you know, you identify so strongly with the heroes, and then you'd see the people who are, you know, really like you in the book, and they're not the heroes. Yeah. And so a lot of what, I mean, The Inquisitor's Apprentice is basically, it's the first children's book I wrote. I wrote it really for my kids, and it's really just trying to put them and kids like them in the middle of the book instead of, and I know, like, I remember back to being a kid and moments where, I mean, I remember reading Harry Potter even as an adult and being like, I think it was so awesome that there were 2 Jewish kids at the school, yay, even though they only came in one sentence. But it was really great, like, I loved her for it. And I also remember the power of the impact on me in reading Witch Week, which is one of the Chrestomanci Chronicles, where one of the major characters is an Indian kid at the English boarding school. And if anybody's read a lot of the English boarding school books, which kind of middle-class Indian kids do read still in school a lot of times, they're really kind of troublesome things to give. You know, I mean, they really are racist.
Yeah.
And so, for me, I almost feel like what I write is in conversation with the things that I read when I was a kid, but trying to kind of open up that tradition and bring in a real organic sense of kind of where I come from and a more complicated ethnicity.
Well, right in the middle is of the beginnings of most of your careers was when Harry Potter was published. And did you feel that Harry Potter changed how children's books were written and published? Do you feel like you started playing one game and then they changed the rules on you?
My first book came out 3 months before the last Harry Potter book, so I think I was already in a landscape where Harry Potter had changed the way that children's books were written and perceived, and the way that the market was perceived at that point. But I don't know, I'd be curious about somebody who was published earlier.
No, I was first published 2005. Harry Potter was already a thing, but it beat out Twilight by several months.
But how did it change the face of publishing for children?
Well, I mean, I remember, I guess there must have been the first 4 books were out when I finished my first novel. It was I think, must have been 2000. And I remember I finished Tide, and I was so tired because I worked on this book for 5 years, and for the last 6 months, all I had done was mess with this book because I didn't know how to write a book, and I couldn't make the characters do anything. And finally, they seemed to have. I was like, this is a book-shaped object. It appears to have an arc and everything, and look, the ending, it looks like an end. And I didn't know what to do with myself, and I had been hearing about these Harry Potter books. And I sat down and read the first 4, just blew through them, and it was very, very enjoyable because it's very, very different than anything I had been working on. And at the time, they were huge, but they were not what they were certainly not what they would become. And, I think when I remember even as they were huge, they continued to grow, and I think that they pulled publishing towards a different age. I mean, when I came into publishing in 2002, picture books, huge. I mean, people wanted to talk about picture books. I remember my agent Barry made me go to an SCBWI conference to meet a bunch of other people, and so I had never been to one before. And if you don't know, there's Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and I guess somebody had told people to network in line for everything, and so I was in line for the bathroom, and people were networking in line, and someone in line turned to me and said, what do you write? And I said, young adult. And they turned around to talk to somebody else, because there was just no point in talking to a young adult writer. Like, it wasn't that big of a deal. Like, if you weren't a picture book writer, you were not where the industry was at that time. And so I think that the gravitational pull of Harry Potter seems to have pulled people into really loving, the older genre, books for older kids.
I think I think it's become the closest thing we have to a book that everybody has read. That now everybody in the world. And we all get that letter. I got that. I mean, Holly's got this, I think, when she was on tour for the Spiderwick movie, and they said to her, so did you get griffins from J.K. Rowling? Oh. And I've gotten so did you get basilisks or vampires or whatever from J.K. Rowling? And you have to stop and take a breath. And my husband always reminds me, no matter how popular you could ever dream of becoming, there will always be some people for whom your book is the least popular thing that they have ever read. And so I have to stop and kind of be like, for a lot of people, this is the first and only and sort of canonical fantasy thing that they've read, and it's introduced them to fantasy, to the world of fantasy, the way that once, like the Tolkien did. I think that, in a lot of ways, it's been absolutely great for us. It's gotten adults reading younger people's fantasy. It's gotten kids, reading more and more fantasy. And so, and I think that it's shifted as Holly said, it shifted the focus of the industry up to sort of middle grade, and then Twilight came along and kicked it up a little bit further into young adults. So that's sort of where we are right now.
Can I test that? I mean, who here has read Harry Potter? Okay, who hasn't read Harry Potter in this room?
Okay.
There were three.
You mean like a minimum of one book, right?
Yeah, you just has to be one book. You just have to have read one of them.
Yeah.
All right, does anyone revise? Who's not read one book?
We're talking about any book?
Never even seen a book.
Well, look around.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in some ways, Harry Potter created new readers, which created more demand. So it made it easier for those of us whose natural, I mean, what I write just comes out YA, and it's always been that way. Even before I even knew YA existed, that's just what I naturally write. So it's been extremely convenient for me that it has become, I hesitate to call it a genre because it's actually every genre. I mean, YA is a category. We were kind of joking about this on Twitter because there was yet another kind of New York Times opinion piece about YA that basically talked about YA as if they are all Hunger Games. And I said, if you want a representative YA book, it has to be romantic, crime, thriller, mystery, horror, realist, I'm forgetting something, and it has to be a graphic novel.
Fantasy.
And it has fantasy, and it has to be written in verse. that would cover. And Western, I left out Western, there are YA Westerns. So basically it would have to be every single genre. So no YA is representative. But that's why it makes it such a comfortable place to write if you actually love every genre and want to write all of them. It's, it's where you can do it. So.
And I do think, I think I came along late enough, and I also sort of read the Harry Potter books first before I was published, and I think right around the time I was even starting. I mean, I just didn't have that sort of, who is this person, where did she come from, why is she the one who's famous reaction. And I actually really enjoyed the books when I read them, and I've reread them, and I actually have to say, honestly, as a writer, when I read those books, I think, you better up your game. They're really, she knows how to write a book that you cannot put down, and how to deal with fairly serious issues in ways that are really accessible to people and really resonate, I think. But I also think, I mean, on the second stem of defending Harry Potter, just to be a contrarian in a group of writers.
Nobody here is bashing Harry Potter. No,
I'm not saying. But I do think just the financial success of it has opened up the genre to a lot of books that would never have been bought by anybody before Harry Potter came out. And I feel personally grateful for that. And I also feel grateful for a lot of really unusual, quirky, interesting, different YA and middle grade fantasy that, you know, I will come across my desk as a book reviewer and just as a reader, that I kind of look at and I think that's there because publishers are kind of desperately throwing everything at the wall they can to get the next Harry Potter, and they don't sort of care, you know, if it sort of walks and quacks like Harry Potter, they're willing to buy it, even if it's really weird. And I like the really weird stuff, so I'm happy that that space is there.
Well, it also brought a lot of things back into print, which is
It was so hard to find so many
Diana
novels.
I'm happy just, you know, for that.
Yeah, I'm so happy for that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that some of the original bad reaction to Harry Potter from people who read a lot of fantasy was the first time I heard of it was a friend saying, "Oh my God, I know you like fantasy, and this is the best fantasy book I have ever read in my entire life. You will love it." And this particular friend had never read any fantasy before, and she gave it to me, and I was just like, I've seen all of this before. So, I you know, that was not the way this happened to me. Like, cause she, you know, she was full, it's so original. Like, there's a wizard school. I'm like, okay. You know, and it had, I mean, I had every single element in Harry Potter I've seen before, but to me that is not a flaw. I mean, that is true of many of my favorite books, that it all comes, I mean, everything comes from somewhere. But it was just kind of constantly being told by people. And then kind of once my book was out, my first book came out and I was accused by several people of ripping off Harry Potter. And I still don't understand what, because I mean, it could not be more different. So it is the thing that Cassie was talking about, that it is the introductory book and they see everything, you know, through that
lens.
Yeah, it's like L.J. Smith's Vampire Diaries series that were published in the early 90s and re-released on the back of the success of Twilight. She gets a steady stream of letters to her accusing her of plagiarizing a book that was published 14 years after her. You know,
she traveled back in time.
But I mean,
she's like, I have a plan.
Well plotted.
To me, Rowling's accomplishment is the things you were talking about in the characters. That they're so engaging, and you know, I mean, I was really pissed off at that first book because of the way it was introduced, but I read all of them. You know, and I couldn't, you know, so there was something that kept me going despite having the worst possible introduction to the first one.
And I have to confess, I have had moments like that. The one moment I had like that was when I got somebody to read Garth Nix's Sabriel series, and he said, well, just kind of, I don't know, you know, not as good as Harry Potter. Harry Potter is more original. And, yeah, I mean, clearly they just felt like he was kind of ripping off Harry Potter. Like,
But he also went back in time.
But that's not.
But also, and Garth himself says that he was in this tiny little, all Australian writers know each other, just so you know. So
they're actually all the same person. I wasn't supposed to say that, was I?
So Garth says he was in this tiny little, you know, boat made out of an acorn, just happily paddling along with his quiet little career. And then this giant wave came, which was the Harry Potter phenomenon. And suddenly he was making serious money writing, and it was purely for being reissued and being the answer to the question of the parent coming in. My kid loves Harry Potter, but she's run out. What do I give her
What do I give
next?
next?
And they're like, Garth Nix, Diana Wynne Jones, you know, Jane Yolen, Ursula Le Guin, and suddenly they get this whole new readership, as you were talking about. So.
And actually, I teach writing to kids in the middle-age group, and they do go on from Harry Potter to. I mean, one of the interesting things is it's become much easier to teach writing because everybody's read Harry Potter, so you can talk about story structure and know that every single person in the room between the ages of 10 and 14 will have read that book. But they do go on to read. I mean, they go on to read Ursula Le Guin. They go on to read Jane Austen. They go on to read Diana Wynne Jones. It doesn't. I think some of the adult readers kind of read Harry Potter and they think that was great, and then they go back to reading exactly what they were reading before. But the kids really go to the librarians and say, "I liked this. What do I read next?" And the librarians, you know, have that depth of knowledge to point them.
Speaking of wizard schools and the rest of it, I know that and Ursula K. Le Guin, who we are allowed to speak about, there was something that Helen said that you needed to say about Ursula K. Le Guin, and I really want to hear it.
I'm not sure. So then now I'm going to become fanish and embarrassing. So I'm not sure if it was that my daughter's middle name is Ursula, or if it was that I send her all my books, or if it was that everything I've ever written in my life is essentially, you know, a conversation with her books, Dispossessed for the science fiction and the Earthsea Chronicles for the fantasy.
You're realizing,
Or maybe it was one of my other gushing things.
It was a thing you said. Do you remember you said that you had not realized that women could do this stuff? I was wondering if you could
Oh,
address that.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking, yeah, because so I'll take off my kid's middle grade fantasy writer hat and put on my grown-up science fiction. I write hard SF science fiction with, you know, a lot of math and physics in it in my real day job. And her book, The Dispossessed, was, I mean, if for people who aren't familiar with it, it's a really fabulous classic science fiction book that is about a mathematician, and it's one of the most beautifully and well-written sort of, I don't know, intellectual portraits of the development of a mathematician. And it was a really wonderful book for me. I really identified with that character, and I was also I mean, it was the first time I understood that a woman could write a book about math and science, and that was huge for me because I was a geek. And that was what I wanted to read and write.
Well, so briefly, we're getting a little short on time, but I want to know what you're loving now, what's coming out now that you just think is the most wonderful thing on earth.
Dia Reeves, she's a Texan writer, and her first book was called Bleeding Violet, and the second one is Slice of Cherry. They're very macabre, they're very dark. She's YA. I mean, the second one is about the two daughters of a serial killer, and the serial killer's been locked up, and the two girls are kind of sort of carrying on, but not in a very determined way. Like the opening chapter, this guy breaks into their house to get a serial killer souvenir from their dad. So they lock him in the cellar and tie him up and start cutting him. And it's really, really funny. It is, it's awesomely funny. And everything's set in East Texas in this really strange world where kind of doors open and weird shit pops out. And both books are set in that world. And she's really excellently demented.
I actually really also like Dia Reeves. She's great, and her made-up town is a wonderful thing. I guess I would say in the young adult genre, I do like a lot of the sort of darker stuff. Paolo Bacigalupi's Shipbreaker and the new companion book, The Drowned Cities, which I just finished, are both really great. Hi, Mark. And Laini Taylor's Daughter of Smoke and Bone, which just came out, is beautifully written and does something that I really like, which just kind of takes us out of, you know, so many YA books are set in, you know, sort of a sort of bit of a faceless kind of, any town, and it takes us into Prague and describes the city in a really, wonderful and interesting way. And I love, one of the wonderful things about books is they're the cheapest form of travel. So I would definitely recommend both of those.
Okay, let's see. I agree with everything said so far. And to it I will add, I always, when I get a chance, recommend Megan Whalen Turner, who I think is fantastic. Her Queen's Thief series is one of my favorites. It's set in a sort of Greek fantasy world, and it is clever and twisty and amazing. A book I love that came out pretty recently was called Anna Dressed in Blood by Kendra Bleak, and I thought it's a ghost hunter, a young man who's a ghost hunter and who meets a ghost who kills pretty much everybody who comes near her, but doesn't kill him for some reason, and he has to figure out what to do about her.